Elizabeth Whitaker's hands did not shake when she heard it. That was the cruelest part. She stood in that hallway with 3 months of her life pressed against her chest, every page of the anniversary journal she had written by hand, every memory she had believed they shared, and listened to her husband tell his friends in the easy voice of a man who felt completely safe that if given the chance again, he would have chosen someone else. She did not drop the journal. She did not make a sound. She simply stood there and understood with the terrible clarity of a woman who has finally stopped lying to herself that she had spent 5 years loving a man who had never once chosen her back, and that tonight that ended. If this story moves you, subscribe to this channel and follow Elizabeth all the way to the end. She earned every word of it. And drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The Whitaker estate had never looked more beautiful than it did that July evening in 1818. Lanterns hung from the oak trees lining the long front drive, their warm amber light swaying gently in the summer air. The wooden mansion, 3 stories of polished Virginia timber, wide wraparound porches and tall shuttered windows glowed against the deep blue of the evening sky. Inside, the sound of fiddle music drifted beneath the low hum of conversation, and the smell of roasted meat and fresh-cut flowers filled every room from the parlor to the back hall. It was the kind of night that made a person believe everything in the world was exactly as it should be. Elizabeth Whitaker had spent 6 weeks preparing for this evening, not because Jonathan asked her to. He never asked. He simply expected the way a man of his standing expected rain to stay away from his fields and his tenants to pay on time. Jonathan Whitaker expected the world to arrange itself neatly around him, and for 5 years of marriage, Elizabeth had been the quiet, steady hand doing the arranging. She had ordered the flowers from 3 separate counties. She had coordinated with the cook for 2 full weeks over the menu. She had written every invitation by hand, folded each one herself, and personally ensured that every family of standing in the county received theirs with enough advance notice to make proper arrangements. She had done all of this while also managing the household accounts, overseeing the repair of the eastern fence line, tutoring 2 of the tenant children whose mother had taken ill, and sitting beside old Mrs. Hartley through 4 consecutive evenings when the woman's cough worsened and her family could not afford a second doctor's visit. Nobody at the party knew any of that. That was fine with Elizabeth. She had never done those things for recognition. She moved through this crowd that evening with practiced ease. A quiet word here, a gentle redirect there, smoothing over the moment when 2 of the county's oldest rivalries nearly surfaced over a point of land dispute, refilling a glass before its owner noticed it was empty, guiding the conversation back to lighter ground whenever someone's pride began to swell too visibly. She was good at that. She had always been good at that. At 30 years old, Elizabeth Monroe Whitaker was not the most beautiful woman in the room. She knew it, and she had made peace with it long ago. She was slender and pale, with dark hair that never quite stayed in its pins and eyes the color of creek water in November, gray-green and changeable. Her face was pleasant rather than striking. She had her mother's sharp cheekbones and her father's stubborn jaw, and when she smiled, it was always slightly crooked, tilting more to the left than the right. What she had always had, was presence. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that filled a room the moment she walked in and demanded that every eye turn. Her presence was quieter than that. It was the kind that people noticed only after she had left. The way a conversation felt lighter when she was part of it. The way problems had a way of dissolving in her vicinity without anyone quite being able to point to how. She had built that presence over 30 years of paying attention to people, of listening, of caring more about what was true than about what was convenient. She was crossing the wide main hallway, a tray of crystal glasses she had retrieved from the kitchen herself, because one of the serving girls had twisted her ankle when she heard it. The voices were coming from the parlor. The door was not fully closed. A finger's width of candlelight spilled out into the hallway, and through it carried the easy, comfortable laughter of men who felt entirely at home in the world. She recognized the voices immediately. Thomas Hargrove Landowner, 2 counties east. Preston Alcott, his brother-in-law with his sharp opinions and his sharper suits. And Jonathan, her husband. His voice was the deepest, the most assured, and the most familiar to her in all the world. She had not meant to stop and listen. She had been walking past. But she slowed when she heard her own name, not because Jonathan said it, but because he didn't say it. She heard it in the shape of the conversation, in the pause before he answered. 5 years now, Whitaker. Thomas Hargrove was saying, his tone warm, with the self-satisfied pleasure of a man making a predictable joke. 5 years of marriage. Tell me honestly, are you a happy husband? There was a short silence. It was the kind of silence that a wife learns to interpret. Elizabeth had become expert at reading Jonathan's silences over the course of their marriage. This one was not the silence of a man choosing his words carefully because he wanted to be truthful. It was the silence of a man calculating not what was honest, but what was safe to say. Happy enough, Jonathan said finally. More laughter. Easy laughter. The laughter of men who understood one another without having to say anything plainly. Come now. Preston Alcott pressed, and Elizabeth could hear the edge of amusement in his voice, the particular tone of a man who enjoyed drawing blood from comfortable situations. No man married 5 years is only happy enough. What's the honest answer, Jonathan? If you had the choice again, same circumstances, same options on the table, would you have chosen her? Another silence. Elizabeth's hand tightened on the tray. Between you and me, Jonathan said, and his voice shifted lower, more private, laced with the easy confidence of a man, certain he was not overheard. Between you and me, gentlemen, I believe I would have chosen differently. Laughter again, louder this time. Come now, one of them said through the amusement. She manages the house well enough. She manages it perfectly. Jonathan agreed, and there was something almost fond in his tone, which was somehow the worst part of all. Elizabeth is a perfectly capable woman, steady, dependable. But a man wants more than steady, doesn't he? A man wants... He stopped. Someone else said something Elizabeth couldn't catch. More laughter. The conversation shifted. Elizabeth did not move. She stood in the hallway with the tray of crystal glasses in her hands and the sound of her husband's voice rearranging every memory she had of the past 5 years into something she no longer recognized. A man wants more than steady. She thought about this night Jonathan had come home from Richmond with a fever so high he couldn't stand. She had sat beside his bed for 3 nights running, changing the cold cloths on his forehead, spooning broth between his cracked lips, reading aloud to him from the newspaper, because the sound of her voice seemed to be the only thing that kept him calm. She had not slept more than 2 consecutive hours for 72 hours. She had not complained once. She thought about the autumn 2 years ago, when the harvest came in short, and Jonathan's anxiety had made him sharp and difficult, and prone to snapping at everyone around him. She had quietly reworked the household accounts, cut expenses in ways he never noticed, and managed to keep the estate from feeling the strain. She had absorbed his fear and his frustration, and turned it into stability, the way she always did, the way she had always done without being asked or thanked. She thought about the journal tucked under her arm. She had been carrying it all evening, waiting for the right moment. She had spent 3 months making it, filling page after page with the small private history of their marriage. The first winter they spent together when the snow came early, and they were snowed in for 4 days, and played cards until midnight every night. And Jonathan had laughed more in those 4 days than she had ever heard him laugh before or since. The spring he planted the rose garden along the south fence, because she had mentioned once, only once, that her mother had kept roses. The letter he had written her when he was away in Richmond for 2 months. The letter she had read so many times, the paper had gone soft at the folds. She had filled the journal with all of it. Every quiet, unglamorous, tender piece of what she had believed their marriage to be. She looked down at it now. Then she set the tray carefully on the hallway table, not dropping it, not clanging it, setting it down with the same quiet precision she brought to everything, and she walked toward the back of the house. She did not go back into the parlor. She did not push the door open and confront the men inside. She did not raise her voice, or throw anything, or do any of the things that the wild, screaming part of her, the part she had spent 30 years learning to keep very, very quiet, wanted desperately to do. She walked out the back door into the warm July night, and she sat down on the garden steps, and she looked up at the stars over Virginia, and she breathed. The fiddle music floated out from the open windows. Somewhere inside, her husband was laughing with his friends. She sat there for a long time. She was not crying. That surprised her a little. She had always been someone who cried at sad stories, at spring flowers, at the sight of a child learning something new. She cried easily and without embarrassment, and she had always considered that a strength rather than a weakness, because it meant she was paying attention to the world. But she was not crying now. What she was doing was thinking very clearly. She was thinking about the woman she had been at 25, when Jonathan Whitaker had come calling with his good name and his wide acreage and his careful, considered attention. She had not been swept off her feet. She had never been the kind of woman who got swept off her feet. But she had been moved. She had believed with the quiet conviction that characterized everything she did, that Jonathan was a man of more depth than he showed the world. That beneath the polish and the pride was someone who saw more than he said. She had believed she was the person who would get to know that someone. She had spent 5 years waiting. She opened the journal in her lap. The summer dark was deep enough that she couldn't really read the pages, but she knew what was written on each one. She knew it by heart. She turned to the blank page at the back. The last page, the one she had left empty because she had imagined sentimentally that she and Jonathan might fill it together one day, with some future memory they hadn't made yet. She sat with that blank page open in her hands for a long moment. Then she went inside, and she found a pen, and she wrote. She was very quiet about what she did next. That was important to her, the quietness of it. She did not want to make a scene. She did not want to cause talk that would follow Jonathan professionally. Whatever she thought of his words, she was not the kind of woman who burned things down. She had too much respect for herself, and strange as it might seem, still too much respect for him to leave in a way that was designed to wound. She went upstairs while the party was still going. The music was louder now. Someone had started dancing in the main hall. She could feel the vibration of it faintly through the floorboards as she moved through their bedroom. She did not take much. She took the dress she had arrived in Virginia, wearing the plain gray traveling dress that had been her own before she became Mrs. Whitaker. She took her mother's hairbrush, the one with the silver handle gone slightly tarnished. She took the small Bible her father had given her. She took the money she had saved, not Jonathan's money, not household funds, but the small amount she had accumulated over 5 years from teaching the tenant children a coin here and there, pressed into her hand by grateful parents who could not afford much but insisted on giving something. It amounted to a modest sum. Enough to get somewhere. Enough to begin. She left the jewelry. The pearl earrings, the garnet brooch, the simple gold band she had worn on her right hand because her wedding ring was on her left, and she was not ready quite to take that off yet. She left the jewelry because it was not hers. It was Mrs. Jonathan Whitaker's, and she was in the process of becoming someone else. She took the journal. She left the letter on the dressing table propped against the mirror where he would see it the moment he came in. She had written it in 3 sentences. Jonathan, I heard you tonight. I am not angry. I am only releasing you from the burden of a choice you already regret. She did not sign it, your wife. She signed it, Elizabeth. She went out the back again through the garden and through the side gate, and she walked down the long drive while the lanterns still burned in the oak trees and the music still played in the house behind her. She did not look back. The morning came the way summer mornings in Virginia always did, fast and bright and merciless. Jonathan Whitaker woke at his usual hour, reaching across the bed with the half-conscious habit of 5 years of marriage before his hand found empty cold sheets. He lay there for a moment, not yet alarmed. Elizabeth was an early riser. He assumed she had gone down to the kitchen as she sometimes did to speak with the cook about the morning. He dressed. He came downstairs. The house had the particular hollow quiet of a space that had hosted a party the night before, the slight disorder of moved furniture, the faint sweet-sour smell of spilled punch. Not quite clean, the feeling of a celebration recently ended. There was no Elizabeth in the kitchen. Mrs. Whitaker hasn't come down yet this morning, the cook told him, looking puzzled. We expected her early, sir, for the account of what was used last night. Jonathan went back upstairs. He found the letter. He stood in front of the dressing table mirror and read 3 sentences, and understood with a clarity. He was not prepared for that. Something had gone terribly wrong. He went through this room quickly looking for what was missing. Her jewelry was there. Her good dresses, the silk, the wool, the cream-colored one she wore to church, all hanging. Her hairbrush was gone. The small Bible from her nightstand was gone. The journal he had never seen before was gone. He sat down on the edge of the bed, sat down hard, like something had taken the strength from his legs, and he read the 3 sentences again. I am only releasing you from the burden of a choice you already regret. He had not known she was there. That was the thing that kept surfacing, insisting on being the first thought when there were so many thoughts that should have come before it. He had not known she was standing in the hallway. He had believed himself entirely among friends. He had been performing for an audience of people who would have thought less of him for sentiment. He had been doing what men of his standing did in company like that, deflecting, diminishing speaking, in the easy cynicism of men who could not afford to be seen caring too much. He had not meant it, but he heard himself saying it anyway inside his own memory, and he heard it the way she must have heard it from the hallway holding whatever she had been carrying, and for a moment, Jonathan Whitaker could not breathe. I went downstairs and asked if anyone had seen Mrs. Whitaker leave. One of the stable boys, young James 15, who worshipped Elizabeth, the way most of the estate's workers did, with the particular loyalty that comes from being seen and treated kindly by someone who didn't have to bother, told him quietly that he had heard the side gate open sometime around midnight. He had thought it was one of the late departing guests using the shortcut to the road. Did you see who it was? James hesitated. I think it was Mrs. Whitaker, sir. She was carrying a bag. I almost called out, but... He stopped. But what? She looked like she didn't want to be called to sir. The boy's voice was careful, steady, in the way of someone choosing words very deliberately. She looked like a woman who knew where she was going. Jonathan stood in the stable yard and felt the summer heat pressing down on his shoulders like a physical weight. The county would know by noon. A woman who disappeared the morning after her husband's party, there would be talk. There was always talk. He knew how talk worked in a small Virginia county, had grown up watching it move through communities like weather-shaping reputations and dismantling them with equal indifference. But what struck him standing there in the bright morning was not the talk. What struck him was the image of Elizabeth standing in the hallway, which he hadn't witnessed, but which he could see now clearly and completely, as though someone had painted it. Her face. The thing she must have been carrying. The 3 sentences she had written, instead of a storm of fury, instead of a scene, instead of all the righteous anger she would have been entirely entitled to. I am not angry. He went inside and sat in his study and looked at his hands for a long time. Chatter. The first 3 days he told himself she would come back. This was a misunderstanding. Not a small one, not a comfortable one, but a misunderstanding nonetheless. She had heard something in the worst possible context, stripped of the social performance he had been giving, and she had reacted understandably. Of course, understandably with pain. But she was a reasonable woman. Elizabeth was the most reasonable woman he had ever known. She would find a place to stay, she would have a few days to compose herself, and she would come back and they would speak about it. He waited. She did not come back. By the 4th day, he sent a quiet inquiry to her sister in Richmond. Her sister had not seen her. By the 6th day, he found himself in the room that served as Elizabeth's sitting room, a small space off the main parlor that she had arranged entirely to her own taste, which Jonathan had entered perhaps 3 or 4 times in 5 years of marriage. He stood in the middle of it and looked. She had kept her books on a low shelf near the window. There were more of them than he had realized: philosophy, history, several volumes of poetry, practical guides to medicine and farming and household management. She had annotated many of them. He could see the pencil marks in the margins from where he stood, her small, precise handwriting crowding the edges of pages. On the desk was a ledger he recognized as the household accounts. He opened it. He had never looked at the household accounts. He gave Elizabeth a quarterly allowance and trusted her to manage it the way a man of his position trusted capable staff. He had thought of it in those terms, trusted capable staff, and had never examined more closely what management meant in practice. What he found in the ledger made him sit down. The estate ran more efficiently than he had realized. Not moderately more efficiently, significantly. He began to trace the decisions backward following the notations in Elizabeth's handwriting, and he saw column by column the shape of what she had been doing. Supplies bought in bulk before prices rose. Labor costs negotiated down through relationships she had built with local workers over years. Waste eliminated in a dozen small places he had never thought to look. An entire category of expense medical costs for tenant families that she had handled from a discretionary fund she had created from money she had saved through her management of other accounts. He sat with the ledger in his hands for a long time. He thought about what he had said. Dependable. But a man wants more than steady. He closed the ledger. He put it back exactly where he had found it, with the particular care of a man who has just understood that he has been careless with something irreplaceable. Then he stood up and went to find out where his wife had gone. The search took him places he had not expected. He did not send servants. He did not put the inquiry through the county's informal networks of gossip and information, which would have been the efficient route and would have had results within a week. He went himself on horseback riding roads he had not traveled since he was a younger man, with fewer responsibilities and less pride. He asked about Elizabeth in every town and settlement along the most likely routes. What he found, what he kept finding over and over in one place after another, was not what he had expected. He had expected people to know her as Jonathan Whitaker's wife, as the landowner's woman, a secondary figure identified primarily by her relation to him. Instead, he found people who knew her as Elizabeth. In the small settlement of Callaway's Crossing, the woman at the dry goods store lit up when he described her. "Oh, Mrs. Elizabeth. She came through last spring with medicines for the Perkins family. 3 children with fever, their father out of work. She left enough to cover 2 weeks' treatment and wouldn't give her name to be thanked." In the village of Harker's Mill, an old man sitting on the steps of the feed store said quietly, "There was a woman who used to bring books to the children here. Dark hair, quiet way about her. She taught my granddaughter to read. My granddaughter is 12 now. She's going to teach others someday because of that woman." At a church outside Fredericksburg, the minister's wife said, "Mrs. Whitaker visited us several times over the past 2 years. She contributed funds for the winter fuel program. She always came alone. She always left before anyone could make a fuss over her." Jonathan rode home after that conversation and sat in his study until the candle burned out. He had been asked at a party in his own home whether he was a happy husband, and he had answered with the practiced ease of a man who had not been paying attention. He had not been paying attention. That he understood now was the truest and most damning thing he could say about himself. Not that he was cruel, not that he had intended to wound her, but that a woman of this magnitude, a woman that an entire county knew and loved and remembered, had been living in his house for 5 years, and he had summarized her to his friends as steady, dependable. He had looked at a river and seen still water. He had never looked for the current. 3 weeks after Elizabeth's disappearance, Jonathan Whitaker stood in front of his study window in the early morning light and made himself a promise. He was going to find her. Not to bring her back. He understood clearly enough by now that there was no version of this where he simply retrieved his wife and resumed his life. That was not what this was. That had never been what this was. He was going to find her because he owed her the truth. Because he had never told her in 5 years of marriage that she was extraordinary. Because the ledger and the medicines and the old man's granddaughter, who was going to teach others someday, had shown him the precise dimensions of his own blindness, and he was not a man who could live comfortably with that knowledge and do nothing. He packed a bag. He made arrangements for the estate. He told the steward he would be gone as long as it took. He did not know, standing there in the summer morning with the Virginia sun just beginning to climb, whether she would ever forgive him. He thought with a hard honesty that was new for him that perhaps she should not. But he was going to find her. He was going to stand in front of her and say what was true. And whatever she decided to do with that truth would be her choice, because it always should have been her choice from the very beginning, and he had spent 5 years forgetting that. He closed the estate door behind him. He rode north into the summer heat. And somewhere ahead of him, in a direction he had not yet determined, Elizabeth Monroe Whitaker was building a life without him, without his name, without the vast majority of what she had been given in exchange for everything she had given, and she was doing it the same way she had always done everything. Quietly. Precisely. Without waiting to be told she was allowed. He rode for 3 days before he found the first real trace of her. Not a rumor. Not a second-hand account from someone who thought they might have seen a woman matching her description passing through on a Wednesday. A real trace, solid, specific, the kind that sat in his chest like a stone when he heard it. It came from a widow named Mrs. Clara Bowen, who ran a small boarding house at the edge of a settlement called Mill Haven, 2 days' ride northeast of the Whitaker estate. Jonathan had stopped to water his horse and ask his usual questions, expecting the usual results. Vague recollections, polite uncertainty, the particular helplessness of people who had not been paying close attention. Mrs. Bowen had been paying very close attention. "Young woman," she said, looking him over with the frank assessment of a woman who had spent 40 years deciding which men were worth her time. Dark hair, gray eyes, quiet way of speaking, but you got the sense she was thinking 3 things at once while she talked to you. Jonathan felt something loosen in his ribcage. Yes, that's her. She stayed 4 nights. Mrs. Bowen folded her arms. Paid prompt. Didn't complain about anything. Helped me in the kitchen on the second morning without being asked. I told her she was a guest, and she said she didn't know how to sit still when there was work to be done. The older woman paused, studying him. She left a week ago. Said she was heading toward Sutter's Creek. Did she say why? She said there was a school there that needed a teacher. Mrs. Bowen's eyes didn't move from his face. She said she'd been told she was good at teaching, and she reckoned it was time she did it for herself, instead of doing everything for everyone else. Jonathan stood very still. "You her husband?" Mrs. Bowen asked. Her voice had not changed, but something in it had sharpened. "Yes." The woman looked at him for a long moment. Long enough that Jonathan felt the examination of it, the specific, unflinching scrutiny of a woman taking accurate measure of a man. "She never said a word against you," Mrs. Bowen said finally. "Not one word. In 4 days, she never once complained or explained or asked me to feel sorry for her." She paused. "That told me more than complaining would have." Jonathan had no answer for that. He thanked her, paid for his water, and rode north. I thought about what she'd said for the next 2 hours without stopping. She reckoned it was time she did it for herself, instead of doing everything for everyone else. He had known abstractly that Elizabeth taught. She tutored the tenant children. He had been aware of that, the way he was aware of things that happened on the estate that didn't require his direct involvement. He had filed it mentally under the broad heading of "Elizabeth manages the household," and moved on. He had never asked her if she liked it. He had never asked her if teaching was something she had wanted for herself before she became Mrs. Jonathan Whitaker, and her wants became largely invisible inside the architecture of his life. He hadn't asked because he hadn't thought to, and he hadn't thought to because he had never once looked at his wife and wondered what she had given up. The road stretched ahead of him, pale and dusty in the July heat, and Jonathan Whitaker rode harder than he needed to. Sutter's Creek was smaller than he expected. A main road with a handful of storefronts, a church at one end, a mill at the other. Maybe 40 families within calling distance, with another handful of farms scattered across the surrounding land. The kind of settlement that existed everywhere in Virginia in those years, not quite a town, not quite nothing, held together by the particular stubbornness of people who had decided this was where they were staying. He asked for the school. A boy of about 9 pointed him toward a low wooden building set back slightly from the main road beside a large oak tree whose roots had buckled the ground around it into ridges and humps that the children had clearly been using as an obstacle course. Jonathan could hear before he reached the door the sound of voices inside, young voices, a murmur of them, and over that murmur, one voice he knew as well as he knew his own heartbeat. She was reading aloud. He stopped outside the open window. He could not see her from where he stood, but he could hear every word. She was reading from a history, something about the founding of the Virginia colony. A dry subject made vivid by the way she read it, slowing on the dramatic moments and quickening through the connective tissue, making 300 years of settled time feel immediate and alive. A child's voice interrupted, "Why didn't the women get to vote on any of it?" There was a brief pause. Then Elizabeth's voice, steady and unhesitating. "Because the men who made those decisions hadn't learned yet that they needed women's judgment to make them properly." A beat. Then, "Did they ever learn?" "Some of them," Elizabeth said. "The clever ones." Jonathan stepped back from the window. He stood in the oak tree's shade and breathed for a moment. His horse shifted behind him, impatient, and he put his hand on the animal's neck automatically. "I was not ready to walk through that door." He understood that clearly. He had ridden 3 days telling himself that finding her was the goal, that once he found her, the rest would follow in some shape he hadn't yet determined. But standing 20 feet from the sound of her voice, he understood that he had not actually thought through what came after finding her. He had focused on the journey the way a man did when the destination frightened him. He walked in anyway, because standing outside was worse. The room held 14 children between the ages of 6 and 12. They were seated on benches arranged in 2 rough rows, with a smaller group of younger ones near the front, who looked too young for proper instruction, but had apparently shown up anyway and been absorbed into the lesson. They all looked up when the door opened. Jonathan had the distinct experience of being assessed by 14 pairs of eyes simultaneously, with the frank and pitiless curiosity of children who had not yet learned to be polite about staring. Elizabeth looked up last. She was standing at the front of the room with a book open in her hands, and when she saw him, the expression that crossed her face happened too fast for him to read it completely. Something that moved through surprise, and something else, and landed in a careful, composed stillness that he recognized from 5 years of marriage. It was the face she wore when she was deciding how to respond to something before she responded to it. He had always admired that about her. He had never said so. "Children," she said, her voice entirely steady. "I'd like you to continue reading the next passage silently. Give me just a moment." She walked toward him. The children watched with undisguised fascination. Jonathan held the door open and stepped back outside, and Elizabeth came out and pulled the door nearly shut behind her, leaving just enough of a gap that she could hear if anything went wrong inside. She looked at him. He had thought somewhere in the 3 days of riding that seeing her would clarify things. That being in her presence would make it obvious what to say. He had rehearsed things, scraps and pieces of what he wanted to tell her, and standing in front of her in the oak tree's shade, with the Virginia heat pressing down on both of them, every word he had rehearsed dissolved completely. What came out was, "You look well." She blinked. "That's what you led with." It was not a question. It was the specific dry tone of a woman identifying an absurdity. And despite everything, despite the gravity of the moment and the weight of everything between them, Jonathan felt the corner of his mouth try to move. "I know," he said. "I know, He stopped. Started again. "I've been writing for 3 days, and I had a great deal of time to think about what I was going to say to you, and none of it is coming out right." "Then perhaps," Elizabeth said, "you should say the true thing instead of the right thing." He looked at her. Really looked the way he had not apparently been looking for years. She did look well. Not restored or relieved or visibly happier, but something more substantive than any of those. She looked like a woman who had made a decision and was living in the clarity of it. Like someone who had set down a weight they'd been carrying so long they'd stopped noticing it. "I heard you," he said finally. "That night. The things I said to Hargrove and Alcott." He paused. "I need you to know that I was performing, that I was Jonathan." Her voice was not harsh. That was what made it land so completely, the simple, direct patience of it. "Don't tell me you didn't mean it. Don't start there." He closed his mouth. "Because whether you meant the exact words or not," she continued, "something made those words available to you. Something made them feel like the safe, natural thing to reach for when someone asked if you were happy." She held his gaze. "I need you to think about what that something is. Not to protect my feelings. Not to give me an explanation I can accept. I need you to actually think about it." The honest answer sat in his chest like a coal, hot and hard and difficult to hold. I stopped paying attention, he said. I stopped seeing you as a person with I treated our marriage like a managed property. I treated you like something that functioned correctly, and therefore didn't require my attention. The words came harder than any he had spoken in years. That is the truest thing I can tell you. Not that I didn't care, but that I cared poorly. That I cared the way a man cares about things he takes for granted. She was quiet for a moment. Inside the classroom, he could hear the low rustle of children doing their best to look like they weren't listening through the gap in the door. "How did you find me?" Elizabeth asked. "Mrs. Bowen, in Millhaven." He paused. "Before that, a man in Harker's Mill told me about a woman who taught his granddaughter to read. Before that, a woman in Callaway's Crossing told me about medicine you left for the Perkins family. Before that, the minister's wife in Fredericksburg told me about the Winter Fuel Fund." He stopped. "Let that sit. Elizabeth, I rode for 3 days asking strangers about my wife, and every single person I spoke to knew exactly who you were." Something shifted in her face. Not softening, not yet, but a recognition of something. "They're kind people. They love you," he said. "They don't know me at all, but they love you. And I live in the same house you did for 5 years, and I summarized you to my friends as steady and dependable." He felt the shame of it fresh, saying it aloud to her directly. "I am not here to ask you to forgive that. I don't think I've earned the right to ask you anything yet. I came because I needed you to know that I saw it, that I understand what I failed to see." Elizabeth looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "There's a bench around the side of the building. I have another 40 minutes before the lesson ends." She turned back toward the door. "Don't go anywhere." He sat on the bench and waited. He listened to the murmur of her voice through the wall question-response, the sound of a child working through something difficult and being guided through it with patient, specific encouragement. He had sat in rooms with Elizabeth hundreds of times. He had never just listened to her before. He thought about the ledger, about the columns of figures that told the story of 5 years of careful, intelligent management that he had never once inquired about. He thought about the journal she had taken, the one he had never known she was keeping. 3 months of work she must have spent on it. 3 months of a project that was entirely private, entirely a labor of love never mentioned. I thought about what it meant to spend 3 months making something for a person who wouldn't have known to look for it. When the children came out, they looked at him with the collective suspicion of people defending their territory. A boy of about 10 stopped directly in front of him, arms crossed. "You the reason she came here?" the boy demanded. Jonathan looked at him. "What's your name?" "Eli." The boy did not move. "She's been teaching us 3 weeks, and she's the best teacher we ever had. Better than Mr. Crane, who fell asleep during his own lessons, and better than the woman from Richmond, who told Hattie her hands were too rough for a girl." He paused for emphasis. "We like her." "So do I," Jonathan said. "More than I showed." Eli studied him with the unnerving accuracy of a child who has not yet learned to accept inadequate answers. "You gonna make her leave?" "No," Jonathan said, and meant it. He realized with a certainty that surprised him. "That's not my decision to make." The boy looked at him for another moment, then gave a short nod and walked off. Jonathan watched him go. Elizabeth appeared in the doorway. She looked at where Eli had gone, then at Jonathan. "He interrogated you." "Thoroughly." She almost smiled. "Almost." "He does that. His mother says he's going to be a judge someday." She came and sat on the other end of the bench, not close, leaving a deliberate space between them that Jonathan recognized as both entirely reasonable and somehow the widest distance he had ever sat across from another person. "Tell me what you found, in the ledger." He looked at her. "You knew I'd look at it. I thought you might, eventually." She laced her fingers together in her lap. "I wasn't hiding anything in it. I just wondered if you'd ever be curious." "I wasn't," he said. "Not for 5 years. And then I was, and I—" He paused. "The discretionary fund. The medical account for the tenants. That was your money. The money from teaching." "Yes. You gave your own earnings back to the estate." "I gave them to the people on the estate who needed them," she said. "That's different." "Elizabeth." "Don't." Her voice was quiet but firm. Don't say it like it was a sacrifice. It wasn't. I did it because I wanted to and because I could. I'm not telling you this to make you feel worse. Then why? She looked at him directly. Because I want you to understand who I am. Not who you thought I was. Not the version of me that functioned correctly and didn't require attention. There was something steely under the quietness of her voice, not anger, but a kind of bedrock conviction. You told your friends I was steady and dependable, like those were small things, like they were the consolation prize. I want you to understand that I was also the person running a functioning household at a level you never examined, and teaching your tenants' children to read, and making sure the sick families on your land had medicine in winter. And I was doing all of that because I believed in the life we were building together. She paused. I just didn't know you'd stopped building it. Jonathan did not speak for a moment. The heat of the July afternoon pressed down on the bench on the shade at the edge of the oak's reach on the space between them. I don't know when I stopped, he said honestly. I don't know if there was a specific moment or whether it was gradual. Whether I simply got comfortable and comfortable became invisible. He turned to look at her fully. I do know that I am sitting on a bench outside a schoolhouse in a settlement I'd never heard of 3 weeks ago, and every person I spoke to on the way here knew who you were, and that is the single most clarifying experience of my adult life. Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. Then, Jonathan, why did you really come? I told you. You told me what you found and what you understood. That's not what I asked. Her eyes were steady on his. Why did you come? What did you want when you got on that horse? What were you hoping for? He had thought writing here that he had an answer to this question. He had believed his answer was to explain myself and then perhaps to see if there was any path forward. Clean, reasonable answers. Adult answers. Sitting on the bench under the oak tree, with the woman who had been making his world function for 5 years. Without his full attention, he understood that those were not true answers. They were the answers he had prepared, because the true answer was difficult. I wanted you to come home, he said. I wanted to fix it. I wanted to... He stopped, pressed forward through the discomfort. I wanted to make this thing I did into something I could manage and resolve and move forward from. Because that's what I do. I identify a problem, and I address it, and I move forward. And I came here thinking this was a problem I could address. And now I understand it isn't. I understand that you're not a problem I mishandled. You're a person I failed to know. He met her gaze. And that isn't a problem I can resolve. That's just something I have to live with. What I can do, the only thing I can do, is tell you that I see it. And that whatever you decide, I'm not going to stand here and ask you to make it easier for me. Silence. A bird, somewhere in the oak above them. The distant sound of the mill. The creak of the settlement going about its afternoon. There's a room at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, Elizabeth said finally. At the end of the main road. It's modest, clean. She looked at her hands for a moment, then back at him. I'm not ready to talk about what comes next. I need you to understand that. I understand. I mean it, Jonathan. I haven't decided anything. I haven't decided to come back or to stay here permanently or to anything. I am in the middle of something. She lifted her chin. I am in the middle of finding out who I am when I'm not arranging my existence around yours. That takes time. I won't rush it because you rode 3 days and you feel guilty. I wouldn't ask you to, no. She studied him. You might want to, though. You might find it difficult. Waiting without resolution, without knowing where things are going. A pause. Can you do that? It was a genuine question, the kind she always asked, the kind that cut straight past the comfortable answer to the actual one. Can you do that? Not will you try, or I hope you will. Can you? I don't know, Jonathan said, but I'm going to try. He took the room at Mrs. Patterson's. It was indeed modest. A narrow bed, a washstand, a window overlooking the back of the property where someone had planted a kitchen garden that had gotten slightly out of hand. He sat on the edge of the narrow bed the first night and listened to the settlement settle into quiet around him, and he thought about what Elizabeth had said. I am in the middle of finding out who I am when I'm not arranging my existence around yours. He had never had to find out who he was. He had always simply known, or believed he knew, which he was beginning to understand was not the same thing. He was Jonathan Whitaker, landowner, man of standing. He had been given those definitions at birth and grown into them like a coat that had always fit without alteration. He had never asked himself what he was without them. He thought about that for a long time in the dark. The next morning, he was up before the settlement. Old habit. He walked the main road in the early light, watching the place come to life the way small settlements did, gradually one household at a time. Smoke beginning from chimneys, and the sound of livestock and someone's chickens with a strongly held opinion about the morning. He did not go to the schoolhouse. He had said he would give her space. He meant it. Instead, he went to the mill. He introduced himself not as Jonathan Whitaker of the Whitaker estate, which meant nothing in Sutter's Creek, but as Jonathan who was staying in town for a while and had some experience with mill operations and land management and was willing to make himself useful. The miller, a large weathered man named Abel Proctor, who looked at him with frank suspicion, said, "We don't need charity help from gentlemen who get bored." "I'm not bored," Jonathan said. "And I'm not offering charity. I'm offering labor. You can put me to whatever use you see fit." Abel Proctor looked at his hands. Jonathan's hands were, he knew this, the hands of a man who signed papers rather than lifted them. Soft in the wrong places, without the useful calluses of actual work. "We'll see how long you last," Abel said, which was apparently the closest he gave to a welcome. Jonathan lasted the full day. He was not good at the work. He was slow and inefficient, and twice caused small problems that Abel had to correct with the patience of a man who had spent his life teaching people things they should already know. But he did not quit, and he did not complain, and at the end of the day, Abel gave him a short nod that Jonathan understood to be the currency of a man who did not issue praise freely. He walked back to the boarding house with his back aching and his hands roughed from unaccustomed work, and he sat at the supper table next to a traveling merchant who talked about road conditions, and he ate everything on his plate. He did not feel sorry for himself. What he felt underneath the ache and the unfamiliarity and the specific humbling quality of a day spent learning to be useful in a place that had no interest in his name was something he did not have an immediate word for. It sat in his chest quietly, uncomfortable and clean. He saw Elizabeth on the third day. He was coming out of Abel's mill at midday when she was crossing the main road with two of her students, the boy Eli and a smaller girl with red braids who was apparently explaining something at high speed and volume. Elizabeth was listening with complete attention, the way she always listened to things she actually cared about. Her whole body turned toward the child, and her face doing the specific thing it did when she was genuinely interested. She saw him across the road. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Eli noticed and looked between them with the narrow assessment of a child who has decided to involve himself in adult situations. "That's him, isn't it?" he said not quietly to Elizabeth. "Eli." Her voice was gentle but firm. "I'm just saying." He was not deterred. "He doesn't look dangerous." "He isn't." She hadn't looked away from Jonathan. "He's just learning something. It's taking him a while." Jonathan heard that across the road. He thought it was probably the most accurate description of his current situation he had encountered, delivered by a woman to a 9-year-old without inflection and without cruelty, and with the particular precision of someone who had always understood the difference between meanness and honesty. He lifted his hat. Elizabeth looked at him for one more moment. Then she said something quiet to her students, and they moved on, and he watched her go. Not away from him exactly, but somewhere she was going on her own terms, which was not the same thing. He put his hat back on. He went back to the mill. 2 weeks and something happened that Jonathan had not anticipated. He had settled into a shape in Sutter's Creek. It was not comfortable exactly. Comfort was not the point of it, but it had become recognizable. He worked at the mill mornings. He spent afternoons in whatever capacity Abel or others in the settlement needed, which ranged from fence repair to helping an elderly farmer move his grain stores before an expected rain. He ate at the boarding house. He did not push Elizabeth for conversation. When they encountered each other at the church on Sunday on the main road, once at the dry goods store, where they reached for the same shelf at the same moment, and both stepped back with an awkwardness that would have been funny under different circumstances. He was careful, present but not pressing, available but not demanding. How was learning slowly and with difficulty how to exist in proximity to someone without requiring something of them. And then, on a Tuesday evening, Eli showed up at his door. Jonathan opened it to find the boy standing on the boarding house step, with his arms crossed and an expression of someone who has made a decision and is committed to it regardless of how it goes. "Mrs. Elizabeth's sick," Eli said. "She won't let Mrs. Patterson call the doctor because she says it's only a summer cold and she doesn't want to fuss. But it's been 2 days and she sounds bad." He fixed Jonathan with a look. "I thought you should know." Jonathan was already reaching for his coat. "I figured," Eli said and stepped aside. He knocked on her door quietly. He heard from inside the sound of a woman who was clearly working to not sound as unwell as she was, and then, "I told Mrs. Patterson I didn't need—" "It's Jonathan." Silence. A long silence. Then, "You can come in." She was sitting up in bed with a quilt pulled around her shoulders and her dark hair loose, and a look on her face that was caught precisely between genuine misery and determined dignity. The specific expression of a person who is unwell and has strong feelings about being seen that way. Her voice, when she'd spoken, was roughed at the edges from several days of coughing. He came in and pulled the chair from the corner and sat beside the bed. "You didn't have to come," she said. "No, I'm fine. You sound like you've been gargling creek gravel." She looked at him sharply. Then, despite herself, something shifted in her face, not quite a smile, but in the neighborhood of one. "It's a cold," she said. "It will pass. It will pass faster if someone brings you proper broth instead of—" He looked at the cold, largely untouched bowl on her nightstand. "That. Mrs. Patterson made it. I'll make it." He stood, paused. "With your permission." She looked at him for a moment. "You don't know how to make broth." "No. But Abel Proctor's wife is 3 doors down, and she does, and I believe I've accumulated enough credit with her husband to ask a favor." He held her gaze. "Let me do something useful, Elizabeth." She looked at him for a long moment, the careful assessing look he had seen 100 times and finally understood the weight of. "All right," she said quietly. I was back within 20 minutes with broth that was significantly better than what was sitting on the nightstand. He sat in the corner chair while she ate it, and he did not talk about the estate or the marriage or any of the large unresolved things floating between them. He talked about Eli and Abel's opinions on grain prices, and the elderly farmer whose grain he'd helped move, and the specific indignity of being outpaced at every physical task by men 20 years his senior. Elizabeth listened. At one point, she laughed a real one, quick and unguarded, before the cough cut it off. "I missed that," Jonathan said, quietly. "Not a performance." She looked at him. The lamp was low, and she was wrapped in the quilt, and she looked tired and unguarded, and more like herself. He thought than he had seen her in a very long time. Maybe ever. "Jonathan," she said. Her voice was careful. "I need to tell you something." He waited. "I found out just before I left the estate. I had been going to tell you at the party that night." She stopped, the cough again shorter this time. "That's what I was coming to find you for when I heard you in the parlor." He felt the stillness settle over him. "Tell me." She met his eyes. "I'm with child," she said. The room was very quiet. The lamp flame moved in some small draft. Outside, the settlement was winding down toward night. Jonathan sat with those words settling into him, rearranging everything, the shape of the past 3 weeks, the shape of the entire journey here, the shape of what was at stake in this room on this particular Tuesday evening in July, and he understood with a clarity that felt like cold water that there was nothing small about any of this. There had never been anything small about any of this. He leaned forward in the chair. He put his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands for just a moment. Then he looked up. "Are you well?" he asked. "The cold, the baby. Both are fine," she said. "Uncomfortable, but fine." She was watching him steadily. I need you to not make this about you, about what it means for you, or what it changes, or how it. I need you to let me finish what I started here first. The school, the work, myself. Her voice was firm beneath the roughness in it. This child is mine, not a reason to come back, not a reason to stay separate. Mine. Do you understand? Yes, he said, without hesitation, without qualification. She looked at him for a long time after that, like she was measuring something, not him specifically, but her own response to him. Like she was checking something internal and important, and not entirely decided. Get some rest, he said, finally standing. I'll bring more broth in the morning. Jonathan. He paused. Thank you, she said. For coming. She stopped. For staying. He nodded once. He picked up his coat. He walked out into the July night and stood in the road for a long moment, looking up at the sky over Virginia, and he breathed. There was a child. There was a woman inside a boarding house who had built a life in 3 weeks from almost nothing, and she was carrying his child, and she had been coming to tell him that very night when she heard him say he would have chosen differently. He thought about the journal, about the blank page she had left at the back. I thought about what it might take to be worthy of having something written there. He went back to his room. He lay in the narrow bed. He did not sleep for a long time. But it was not the sleeplessness of a man without a plan. It was the sleeplessness of a man who had finally precisely understood what it was going to take. He brought the broth every morning for 4 days. He did not ask for conversation. He did not linger past the point of usefulness. He left the broth, asked one question about how she was feeling, received an answer, and went back to the mill. He was learning the discipline of presence without pressure, which was harder than any physical labor Abel Proctor had assigned him, and Abel Proctor had assigned him some genuinely punishing physical labor. On the 5th morning, Elizabeth opened the door before he knocked. She was dressed. Her color was better. She had her hair pinned up the way she always did when she meant to accomplish something, and she was holding her own empty bowl from the previous evening in one hand, with the clear intention of returning it herself. They stood in the doorway, looking at each other for a moment. You're better, he said. I'm better. She handed him the bowl with the businesslike ease of someone reclaiming their own routine. Thank you, for the broth, and for not making it complicated. I'm trying to learn that. She looked at him steadily. I know you are. A pause. That's not nothing, Jonathan. She went back to her school. He went back to the mill. And somewhere in the space between those two plain sentences, something had shifted, not resolved, not repaired, but shifted. The way ground shifts before it settles. The way a wound stops being raw and becomes something the body is actively working to address. He felt it, and he did not make the mistake of reaching for it too fast. What he did not anticipate was Thomas Hargrove. On a Wednesday, 12 days after he had taken the room at Mrs. Patterson's. Jonathan walked out of the mill at midday and found Thomas Hargrove sitting on a horse in the middle of Sutter's Creek's main road, with the particular settled confidence of a man who has been waiting and wants everyone to know it. Jonathan stopped. Hargrove looked down at him from the horse with an expression that mixed genuine concern with something more complicated. The look of a man who considered himself a friend and had arrived to perform that friendship in a way that would be difficult to refuse. I've been looking for you for a week, Hargrove said. I wasn't hiding. No, you were apparently. Hargrove glanced at the mill, at the state of Jonathan's clothes, at the general evidence of a man who had been doing actual physical work, doing this. He said it the way one might describe an inexplicable personal decision, with bewilderment held carefully in check by politeness. Come inside, Jonathan said. We can talk. They sat in the boarding house's small front room, which Mrs. Patterson vacated with the practiced discretion of a woman who had housed travelers long enough to recognize a private conversation when it walked through her door. Hargrove leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. The county is talking, Jonathan. I expected it would be. Your wife has been gone nearly a month. People are... He paused, choosing. People are constructing explanations. Some of them are not flattering to Elizabeth. Some of them are not flattering to you? Jonathan looked at him. What are they saying about Elizabeth? Hargrove shifted. That she left without cause. That she was unstable. Prone to... Stop. Jonathan's voice was quiet and even. I need you to understand something, Thomas. There was cause. The cause was a conversation you and I and Preston Alcott had in my parlor at a party. My wife had spent 6 weeks organizing, during which I told you that I would have chosen differently. He held Hargrove's gaze. She was standing in the hallway. She heard it. The silence that followed had several layers to it. Jonathan, Hargrove began. I am not looking for absolution, Jonathan said. I am telling you the truth, so that when you go back to the county, you have the truth available to you. My wife left because she heard something that was true in the worst possible way, not intentional, not malicious, but true in the way careless things are true. She left with dignity. She left without taking anything that wasn't hers. She has built a functioning life in 3 weeks from almost nothing, and she is teaching 14 children who adore her. He paused. If the county wants to talk about someone's character, I'd suggest mine is the more productive subject. Hargrove sat with that for a moment. He was not a stupid man. Jonathan had always known that it was why they were friends, or had been in the uncomplicated way that men of similar standing fell into friendship in a small county. What are you doing here? Hargrove asked finally, not critically, genuinely. Waiting, Jonathan said. Working. Trying to understand something I should have understood years ago. He looked at his hands, the hands that were finally starting to show the evidence of actual work. She needs time. I'm not going to take that from her. And I heard there was... Hargrove stopped. Someone said she was... Jonathan looked at him sharply. Hargrove raised his hands. I only heard a rumor. From a woman who passed through here on her way north and stopped at the Alcotts. Who told that woman? I don't know. Jonathan stood up. The movement was controlled, but only just. The county does not get to have that information before I've navigated it with my wife. Do you understand me, Thomas? Whatever you heard, it stays with you. Hargrove looked up at him. Something in Jonathan's face apparently communicated that this was not negotiable territory, because he nodded. Understood. Good. Jonathan sat back down. Some of the tension went out of his shoulder. How bad is the talk? Manageable, for now. But if it goes on much longer, it will go on as long as it needs to. Jonathan's voice was steady. My wife does not set her timeline based on county gossip. Hargrove looked at him for a long moment. Then something in his expression shifted, not quite respect, but adjacent to it. The recalibration of a man who has seen someone he thought he knew clearly behave in an unexpected way. You've changed, Hargrove said. I've started paying attention, Jonathan said. It turns out that changes things considerably. He told Elizabeth about Hargrove's visit that evening. He had not planned to, but she found him on the bench outside the schoolhouse after her afternoon class. She had clearly come looking for him, which was something new, and her expression told him she had already heard something. Abel's wife told me a man came asking for you, she said. Thomas Hargrove. Her jaw tightened fractionally. What did he want? To tell me the county is talking. He met her eyes. I told him the truth about what happened, that I said what I said, that you heard it, and that you left with cause and dignity. I told him any discussion of character should be directed at mine. He paused. He also mentioned a rumor about the baby. He doesn't know where it started. Elizabeth closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, they were steely and calm in equal measure. Of course it did. Elizabeth, no, I'm not surprised. She turned and sat on the bench with the decisive movement of a woman choosing not to let something knock her sideways. People talk. It was always going to happen. She stopped, breathed once deliberately. I did not want them to have that. It's mine. It isn't for the county to manage. I know. Did Hargrove seem as he going to? He'll keep it quiet. I was clear. Jonathan sat beside her closer than their usual careful distance, close enough that she would have had to make a deliberate choice to move away. She didn't. I'm sorry that you're having to think about this at all. On top of... I'm all right. said firmly in the tone of a woman who needs to say it firmly to keep it true. He did not argue with it. He simply sat beside her in the afternoon heat. After a moment, she said, "Hargrove was there, that night, in the parlor." "Yes." "And he came here and told you the county is concerned about appearances." She said it without heat, but with a precision that was its own kind of heat. "The county is concerned about the appearance of a woman who left a situation that was harming her." "The county," Jonathan said carefully, "does not know what it's concerning itself about. Hargrove came because he considers himself my friend. I used the visit to make sure he left with accurate information." He looked at her. "I'm not going to let anyone tell a story about you that isn't true." She looked at him. "That's the first time you've said that." "I know. You should have said it 5 years ago, in rooms full of those same men." "Yes," he said, simple and direct. "I should have." The silence that followed was not comfortable, but it was honest. It was the silence of two people sitting in the accurate territory of what was true without flinching away from its edges. "Hargrove's right that it won't stay quiet indefinitely," Elizabeth said finally. "No, I haven't." She stopped, started again. "I haven't thought beyond the next few months. I've been thinking in small pieces, deliberately." She laced her fingers together. "I know that's not your preferred way of operating. It's becoming mine." He meant it. "I'm not asking you to decide anything, Elizabeth. I'm telling you that whatever you decide, I'm not going to leave you to manage the county's reaction to it alone. That's done. I am not going to be somewhere comfortable while you navigate that by yourself." She was quiet for a long moment. "Abel told his wife you've been working hard," she said. The shift surprised him. Abel Proctor speaks to his wife. Abel Proctor adores his wife. The almost smile was back. "He just doesn't advertise it. She said he told her you didn't quit on the first day, which is apparently the most complimentary thing he says about anyone." "High bar." "Very." She looked at her hands. "She also said you helped old Mr. Garrity with his grain stores before the rain, without being asked." "Garrity couldn't have moved it alone." "No." She looked at him. "You know, in 5 years at the estate, I never once saw you help a tenant move grain." He met her eyes. "I know. You didn't think it was your kind of work." "No." "What changed?" He thought about it honestly, the way he'd been trying to think about everything, without the protective layer of self-presentation that had been his default for so long, he'd stopped noticing it was there. "I stopped being somewhere where my name meant anything," he said. "Abel doesn't know Jonathan Whitaker. He knows Jonathan who showed up soft-handed and slow and kept turning up anyway. Out here, the only currency I have is what I actually do." He paused. "It turns out I needed that. Badly." She looked at him for a long time after that. He could see her processing it, not the words, but something behind the words. Some assessment she was making. Then she stood. "I have papers to mark," she said. "Eli wrote a composition about why judges should be elected rather than appointed. It's 4 pages long and contains at least 6 arguments I can't actually counter." Jonathan looked up at her. "He's going to be formidable." "He already is." She picked up the papers she'd set on the bench. "Jonathan." She didn't look at him when she said it. "I'm glad you came here. I haven't said that plainly. I'm saying it now." She walked back toward the schoolhouse. He sat on the bench in the afternoon heat and watched her go, and felt somewhere underneath the ache and the uncertainty, and all the unresolved weight of everything, something that he recognized after a moment as hope. Quiet and tentative and fragile, but present. He was careful not to reach for it too fast. The twist came on a Thursday morning, 11 days later. Jonathan was at the mill when Abel Proctor came in from the road with an expression Jonathan had not seen on him before, the look of a man who has heard something and is deciding how and whether to pass it along. Abel was not a man who withheld information out of cowardice. He withheld it out of the particular care of someone who knew what information could do once it was moving. He set down the tool he was carrying and looked at Jonathan directly. "There's a man came into the dry goods store this morning," Abel said. "Name of Preston Alcott." Jonathan went very still. "He's not alone. There's a woman with him well-dressed older. Says she's Elizabeth's aunt from Richmond. Abel paused. And there's a man from the county courthouse. Came on what he described as official business. Jonathan was already moving toward the door. Jonathan. Abel's voice stopped him. Not the voice of his employer. The voice of a man who had decided in the past 3 weeks to care about what happened to the people in his vicinity. Whatever that man has come to do, it's got the feel of something someone's been planning for a while. Jonathan looked at him. Thank you, Abel. He walked up the main road toward the dry goods store, with the precise controlled pace of a man keeping his temper behind a closed door. He saw them from 30 feet away. Preston Alcott, impeccably dressed as always, standing outside the store with the posture of a man certain he was about to win something. Beside him, a woman Jonathan recognized as Margaret Whitfield, Elizabeth's mother's sister, a woman with more concern for social appearance than he had ever seen concentrated in a single person. And beside her, a man in a dark coat carrying a leather case who had the professionally neutral expression of someone whose job required him to deliver difficult things and not react to the consequences. They had not yet seen him. He changed course. He went to the school first. Elizabeth was mid-lesson when he opened the door. She looked up, read something in his face immediately, and said to her students with complete calm, "Continue reading the next passage. I'll be right back." She came out and pulled the door behind her. "What happened?" she said. "Alcott is here, with your Aunt Margaret and a man from the courthouse." Her face changed, not into fear, into a cold, clear alertness. "Margaret, how did she—" She stopped. "Hargrove. Hargrove told someone who told—" "Possibly. It doesn't matter right now." Jonathan held her gaze. "Do you know what they're here for? I can guess." Her voice was steady, but her hands, both of them gripping the stack of papers she'd brought out, tightened. "Margaret has very specific ideas about what constitutes a proper family situation. And there's a baby coming. An unmarried woman." She stopped herself. "I'm not unmarried, but a woman living separately from her husband, carrying a child teaching in a settlement without her family's knowledge." She looked at him sharply. "She's going to try to take me back to Richmond. That's Margaret's version of intervention. She'll have found some legal pretext. She won't." Jonathan said it quietly, completely. Elizabeth looked at him. "Jonathan, you don't know." "She won't," he said again. "You don't have to go back to Richmond. You don't have to go anywhere. And you are not going to be managed by Preston Alcott and your Aunt Margaret while you're carrying our child and I'm standing 20 feet away." He said it without elevation, without performance, with the flat and complete certainty of a man who means every word. "Do you trust me to handle this?" She was quiet for a moment. "What does handling it look like?" "Talking to them directly. Making it clear that you are here with my full knowledge and support. That there is no abandonment, no scandal, no instability. That we are navigating something privately, and what they've chosen to insert themselves into is not their concern." "That's not entirely true," Elizabeth said carefully. I am. You are a woman making considered decisions about her own life," Jonathan said. "With my full support. That is entirely true." He met her eyes. "Let me go say that, to their faces, in public." She looked at him for a long, searching moment. "Don't lose your temper," she said. "I won't." "Jonathan." Firmer. "I won't," he said. "I promise you." She nodded once. "Then go." He crossed the main road. Alcott saw him coming, and something moved across his face. Surprise quickly replaced by the social ease of a man who had been trained since childhood to recover from surprise without showing it. "Jonathan," he said, extending his hand. "I hoped I'd find you, Preston." Jonathan shook the hand with exactly the courtesy it deserved, and no more. He turned to the woman in the dark traveling dress. "Mrs. Whitfield, it's been several years." Margaret Whitfield was in her late 50s, with Elizabeth's gray eyes set in a harder face, and the particular posture of a woman who wore her sense of propriety like armor. "Mr. Whitaker," she said. "I came as soon as I heard. My niece." My wife, Jonathan said, is teaching her students. She's well. The baby is well. There is no crisis that requires your journey. Margaret blinked. The situation, Jonathan said, is private, between Elizabeth and myself. He glanced at the man with the leather case. And whatever document you're carrying, I'd like to know who authorized it. The man from the courthouse, a county clerk named Harris. His name was stitched into the case. Cleared his throat with the discomfort of someone who had hoped to perform a procedural task and was now standing in a territorial dispute. I have a writ of it's a welfare inquiry, sir. Authorized by whom? Jonathan's voice had not risen. Harris looked at Alcott. Jonathan looked at Alcott. Alcott had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. There was concern, he said. After what happened at your party. The county, Jonathan said, authorized a welfare inquiry on my wife based on the account of a man who was present at a private conversation and apparently felt compelled to take it to the courthouse. He kept his voice even. It took effort. Preston, we have been friends. I'm going to tell you something as a friend. This is the last time you insert yourself into my marriage. Do you understand me? Alcott held his gaze. I was trying to help. You were trying to manage a situation that reflects poorly on you because you were part of the conversation that started it. Jonathan said it cleanly, without cruelty, the way one states a fact. I understand the impulse, but the way to address your own guilt is not to come to my wife's settlement with a courthouse writ and her aunt. The silence on the main road had the quality of a crowd trying very hard to appear to be doing something else. Margaret stepped forward. Mr. Whitaker, whatever the origin of this, my concern is for Elizabeth. She is with child. She is alone in a settlement. She doesn't know. She is not alone, Jonathan said, and turned to her directly. I am here. I have been here for 3 weeks. I am not going anywhere. My wife is teaching at a school where she is valued. She is well cared for, and she is making decisions about her own life, with my full support. If your concern is genuine, Mrs. Whitfield, then I am telling you she is safe. If you would like to see her, that is her decision to make, not mine. But you will not take her anywhere she does not choose to go. Margaret Whitfield looked at him for a long moment. The armor of her propriety shifted slightly, not removed, but adjusted. He could see underneath it something that was actually concern. Real concern, not performed. He moderated his tone. She's well, he said more quietly. Truly. He paused. She's more herself here than I have seen her in years. I think you'll find that when you see her. Margaret looked at Harris. The writ. Harris closed his case. Given the husband's presence and stated support, the welfare inquiry is resolved. He looked relieved. Good day to you all. Alcott was still watching Jonathan with the expression of a man recalculating something he thought he'd had measured. I was wrong that night, Jonathan said to him, quietly. What I said. I was performing for an audience and I said something that wasn't true, and my wife heard it. The responsibility for what followed is mine, not yours to fix, mine to address. He held Alcott's gaze. Go back to the county, Preston. Tell them whatever you need to tell them, but leave us to manage it. Alcott was quiet for a moment. Then, she was always... He stopped, started again. I always thought Elizabeth was considerably more than you gave her credit for. Yes, Jonathan said. She was. She is. He held the man's gaze. I know that now. I went back to find Elizabeth on the bench outside the school, sitting with her hands in her lap, and the particular stillness of a woman who has been managing her own anxiety very precisely. She looked up when she heard his footsteps. Well, she said. Harris took the writ back. Alcott is going back to the county. Your aunt would like to see you if you're willing. I told her it was your decision. She closed her eyes briefly. Margaret, she does actually care about you, underneath everything else. Elizabeth opened her eyes. I know she does. It's just buried under 17 layers of propriety. She looked at him. How did you handle Alcott? Without losing my temper. She searched his face. Did you mean what you said to him? That it was your responsibility? Not as a performance, not to manage the situation. I meant it, he said. I've been meaning a great deal more than I've been saying lately. I'm trying to change that direction. She was quiet for a moment. The students were at lunch. He could hear them somewhere around the back of the building, the sound of 14 children uncontained for 30 minutes. "Jonathan," she said, "sit down." He sat. "I want to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to hear it without turning it into a resolution or a decision. Can you do that?" "Yes." She took a breath. "When I was standing in that hallway, that night." She was looking straight ahead, not at him. "I wasn't only hurt. I was relieved. Part of me." She paused. "I had been so afraid for so long that the marriage we had was the only kind possible. That what I felt invisible, unimportant, like I was furnishing someone else's life, that maybe that was just what marriage was, what I had to accept." She turned and looked at him. "When I heard you say what you said, something in me broke. But another part said, now you know. Now you can stop waiting for something that isn't coming." Jonathan held her gaze. He did not speak. "I am not telling you that I didn't want the marriage to be different," she said. "I wanted it desperately. I still—" She stopped. "But I am telling you that the woman who walked out that door that night was not only broken, she was also freed. And I am not going back to invisible. I am not going back to being steady and dependable, as though those are small things to offer. Whatever happens between us, however this resolves, I am not going back to that." "I know," he said. "Do you—" "Because it would be easy, Jonathan. When the baby comes, when things settle, when the county's expectations reassert themselves, it would be very easy to slide back, for you to get comfortable again, and for me to— Elizabeth." He turned to face her fully. "I hear you. I am not asking you to trust a promise. I know I haven't earned trust yet." He held her gaze. "I am asking you to watch what I do, not what I say, what I do. And if at any point what I do looks like a man sliding back into comfort, you say so, directly, like you did just now, and I'll listen." He paused. "Because that's the other thing I've been learning, that I wasn't listening. And a man who isn't listening cannot be a husband worth having." She looked at him for a long time. Eli appeared at the corner of the building. He took in the scene, both of them on the bench, closed the specific weight of a serious conversation, and had the unusual good sense to almost disappear again. "Eli," Elizabeth called. "Come meet your lunch properly before you fall over that root." The boy came around. He looked at Jonathan. "Did you deal with the fancy man who came in on the horse?" "I did. Abel's wife said he was trouble. How was managed?" Eli nodded with the satisfaction of someone confirming a prediction. "Good." He went to find his lunch. Elizabeth watched him go. Then she turned back to Jonathan with something in her expression that had not been there before, not resolution, not decision, but a small opening, a door not fully closed. "Margaret is going to have opinions," she said. "I expect so. She's going to have opinions specifically about the school and the settlement, and the fact that I am living in a boarding house at 8 months along." 3 months, Jonathan said. "Fine, 3 months now, but eventually 8 and— Elizabeth." He said her name in the tone he'd been learning, the one without demand in it. "Let your aunt come. Show her the school. Show her Eli's composition about judicial elections. Let her see what you've built here." He paused. "She'll understand. And if she doesn't, you don't need her to." She looked at him. Then slowly, the almost smile arrived. Real this time. Crooked as always, tilting left. "You're different," she said. "I've been told. I don't mean—" She stopped. "I mean you're different than I thought you could be. I thought the man in that parlor was finished, fixed, permanent." She looked at him steadily. "I didn't know you had this in you." He held her gaze. "Neither did I." The afternoon light was long and golden and honest. The way July light in Virginia always was. There was nothing soft about it, nothing that let you pretend things were other than they were. It illuminated the bench, the oak tree, the man and the woman sitting at careful but narrowing distance, and it did not flatter or soften a single thing. It just showed what was there, and what was there was not repaired. Not restored, not resolved, but it was real. More real than it had been in years. Maybe more real than it had ever been because it was built now on what was true rather than what was convenient, and both of them knew it, and neither of them looked away. Inside the school, Eli was eating his lunch and planning something. They could both hear it in the quality of the quiet. "Back to work," Elizabeth said, standing. "Back to the mill," Jonathan agreed. She walked to the school door. She paused with her hand on the frame. "Jonathan." She did not turn. "My Aunt Margaret makes the best pound cake in 3 counties. If she's staying, and she will stay because Margaret never goes anywhere until she's said everything she came to say, I'll ask her to make one." A pause. "You can have dinner with us if you want." He stood up from the bench. "Yes," he said. "I want that." She went inside. He stood in the oak tree's shade for a moment, and the July heat pressed down on his shoulders, and he thought about a blank page at the back of a journal, and what it might mean to be the kind of man who deserved to have something written there. Then he put on his hat and walked back to the mill. There was still half a day's work left, and Abel Proctor did not believe in wasting the afternoon. Margaret Whitfield stayed 5 days. Jonathan had expected the woman to arrive with the force of a seasonal storm, opinionated, relentless, moving through Sutter's Creek, like someone determined to find fault with every arrangement and say so at volume. He had braced for it. He had told himself he would be patient, would hold his temper, would treat Elizabeth's aunt with the respect owed to someone who, underneath the armor of propriety, genuinely loved her niece. What he had not expected was Margaret Whitfield, sitting in the back row of the schoolhouse on her second morning watching Elizabeth teach, and not saying a single word for 45 minutes. Jonathan was passing by the open window when he saw her. The older woman was perched on the edge of a bench built for children, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes tracking her niece with an expression that was doing something complicated on her face, working through something layer by layer. The way a person's understanding of another person sometimes has to dismantle itself entirely before it can rebuild. Elizabeth moved through the lesson without acknowledging her aunt was there. She did not perform for the observation. She simply taught the way Jonathan had come to understand. She did everything with total attention and without need for an audience. Eli was explaining his composition aloud. The judicial election argument. He had gotten to his 4th point and was building to a 5th with the momentum of a boy who had discovered he was good at something and intended to be unstoppable about it. "A judge who answers to no one," Eli said with the particular gravity of a 9-year-old who has decided he is making history, is a judge who has forgotten he's a man. Elizabeth said, "Where did you read that?" "I didn't," Eli said. "I thought of it." The room was quiet for a moment. Then Elizabeth said, "Write it down. Exactly that. Don't change a word." Margaret made a sound in the back row, a small sound, not quite a laugh. Jonathan kept walking. That evening at Mrs. Patterson's supper table, the 4 of them, because Margaret had declared the boarding house's communal dining arrangement the most sensible thing about the settlement, which was her way of approving it without approving it. Margaret cut her pound cake into precise slices and said without preamble to Jonathan, "You let her leave." It was not a question. It was not an accusation precisely. It was a statement issued by a woman who had been forming it for 2 days and had decided it was time. "I did," Jonathan said. "You let her walk out of that estate with almost nothing carrying." Margaret stopped, restarted. "You let her go. She wasn't mine to stop." He held the older woman's gaze. She heard something she should never have heard, and she made a decision from it that was entirely her own right to make. "I could have gone after her that night. I could have—" He paused. "But she needed to go. I understand that now. She needed to find out that she could." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "You're more self-aware than I gave you credit for." "Less than I should be," Jonathan said. "More than I was." Elizabeth across the table was looking at her plate with the expression of someone listening very carefully while appearing not to. "She was always remarkable," Margaret said, in a tone that shifted something personal moving through it. "From the time she was a girl, her mother knew it, her father knew it, everyone who spent more than an hour with her knew it." She set down her fork. "I worried when she married you that she would shrink." That the life would be too managed, too correct. She looked at him. I was right to worry. Yes, Jonathan said. You were. Margaret blinked. She had clearly been prepared for defense, for argument, for the elaborate self-justification of a man protecting his reputation. The plain agreement seemed to briefly disassemble her. What I did not anticipate, she said slowly, was that you would be sitting in Sutter's Creek working at a mill. Neither did I, Jonathan said. Elizabeth finally looked up, the almost smile quick and then contained. Margaret looked between them. Then she picked up her fork again and said in the manner of someone filing something for later use, "The pound cake needs more nutmeg." On her fourth day, Margaret took a walk with Elizabeth that lasted 2 hours. Jonathan did not ask what they discussed. He went to the mill. He repaired a section of the grain housing that had been leaking into the upper mechanism, a job that required considerable patience and several attempts, and Abel stood over him the entire time, offering corrections in the way of a man who deeply enjoys being right. When Elizabeth came back to the boarding house that afternoon, she found Jonathan on the front step cleaning grain dust from his hands with a cloth. She sat down beside him without preamble. She asked me if I still loved you, Elizabeth said. Jonathan was still for a moment. What did you tell her? Elizabeth looked at her hands in her lap. I told her that was the wrong question. She paused. I told her I had never stopped. That wasn't the problem. She looked at him sideways. The problem was whether love was enough when the person you loved had stopped seeing you. He didn't speak. She cried, Elizabeth said, and there was a note of genuine surprise in it. Margaret, she cried, I have never seen that woman cry in my life. She turned to look at him fully. She told me that her own husband, my Uncle William, he died 12 years ago. And she said the thing she regretted most was that she never told him plainly what she needed from him. She said she managed, and she accommodated, and she arranged her life around his, and she never once said directly, I need you to see me. Elizabeth's voice was careful. She said she thought she was being a good wife. She said she didn't understand until after he was gone that a good wife still needs to be seen. Jonathan set down the cloth. She's not wrong that I should have said it more clearly. Elizabeth continued. I told myself that if he loved me he'd notice, that I shouldn't have to ask. But, she stopped. Needing to be asked doesn't make someone incapable of caring. It might just mean they grew up in a world that didn't teach them to look. That's more generous than I deserve, Jonathan said. It's accurate, she said. That's different from generous. She looked at him. I'm not excusing it. I'm understanding it. Those aren't the same thing either. He looked at her. Really looked the way he'd been trying to do for weeks now without the defensive layer that had been his default for so long. She was tired around the eyes, and there was a kind of weight about her that had not been there before, the particular weight of a woman carrying a child and carrying everything else at the same time. But underneath the tiredness, she was lit. That was the only word he had for it. There was a quality to her now that had not been there at the estate. Like something had been freed that had been held for too long in a confined space. He had done that. Not the freeing, she had freed herself. But he had been the confinement. He lived with that knowledge the way a man lived with a scar, not always at the front of the mind, but permanent, always there when pressed. I owe you an apology, he said. A real one. Not the explanation kind. Not the kind where I give you context so the thing I did seems smaller. He turned to face her. I failed you. Not once in a parlor. Consistently. Over 5 years. I had a remarkable woman in my home, and I treated her like furniture I was fond of, and I am sorry. That is the only thing I can say that's true. Elizabeth looked at him for a long time. I know, she said finally. I've known you meant that for a while now. She turned back to look at the road. That's the other reason I haven't been able to send you away. The admission sat between them, quiet and significant. Inside the boarding house, they could hear Margaret issuing Mrs. Patterson unsolicited opinions about the organization of the linen cupboard. Mrs. Patterson was responding with the diplomatic firmness of a woman on her own property. It was, Jonathan thought, genuinely even odds. She's going back to Richmond tomorrow, Elizabeth said. I know. She asked me to come with her. Elizabeth's voice was neutral, giving nothing away. She said I could have the East Room. She said she'd hire a good doctor. She said... She paused. She made a very complete case. Jonathan kept his face still. What did you tell her? Elizabeth turned and looked at him directly. I told her I wasn't finished here. He breathed. I don't know what that means yet, she said. For you and me, for the estate, for I don't know, but I know I'm not finished. The school still needs a teacher. Eli is 4 arguments away from drafting actual legislation. She looked back at the road. And you're still learning things. I'd like to see how that goes. It was not reconciliation. He knew that understood it clearly. It was something more cautious and more honest than reconciliation, which was perhaps better than reconciliation, because reconciliation could be a performance, and this was not. All right, he said. Margaret appeared in the doorway behind them. She looked at the two of them sitting on the front step and said, The linen situation in that cupboard is an absolute disgrace, and went back inside. Jonathan looked at Elizabeth. Elizabeth looked at Jonathan. They didn't speak, but the almost smile arrived on her face, and this time it stayed a little longer than usual before she contained it. Margaret left the next morning with her traveling case and 6 specific instructions for Elizabeth covering diet. Rest, the inadvisability of teaching on her feet for more than 4 hours at a stretch. The name of a doctor in the next county who was by her assessment, the only competent one within 3 days' ride, and her firm opinion that the boarding house mattress was inadequate. She paused before she climbed into the hired coach and looked at Jonathan. Mr. Whitaker, she said. Mrs. Whitfield. She held his gaze for a moment with Elizabeth's gray eyes in a harder face, and he had the distinct sense of being measured against a very precise internal standard. I came here ready to bring my niece home, she said. Against her will if necessary. I want you to know that. I know. I was wrong to do it that way. Not wrong to come. Wrong to come with a courthouse writ and Preston Alcott. She paused. That man is a fool. He meant well. Fools usually do. She looked at him steadily. My niece is more than most men can manage. I have known that since she was 8 years old. She organized her father's library alphabetically by subject, and then by author within each subject, and then corrected him when he shelved something incorrectly. A pause. She was 8. I believe it. I do right by her, Margaret said. Not because it's expected. Not because the county is watching. Because she deserves it, and because... Her voice went briefly unsteady, which he suspected cost her considerably. Because women like Elizabeth are rare, and men do not always understand that until they have already failed to deserve them. She got into the coach. Jonathan stood in the road until it was out of sight. Then he went back to the mill because Abel Proctor did not believe in sentimentality during working hours. 2 weeks passed. Then 3. Summer began to turn at its edges. The mornings were fractionally cooler, the light shifted, spending less time at its full midday height, beginning its slow lean toward the longer shadows of August. Jonathan had stopped counting the days. He had stopped somewhere in the middle of the mill work, and the bench conversations, and the dinners at the boarding house table, and the Tuesday afternoons, when Elizabeth sometimes brought her marking outside and sat in the oak tree's shade, while he sat at the other end of the bench, and they talked about the school, about Eli's latest argument about the estate and what needed managing there, about books she was reading and opinions she held, and things she had thought about for years and apparently never had anyone interested enough to discuss with. He had stopped counting because counting had implied a destination, an end point, a resolution he was waiting to arrive at. He was not waiting anymore. He was here. Actually here in a way he had not been actually anywhere for years. The crisis came on a Thursday. It came quietly, the way the worst things often do, not dramatically, not with warning, but in the particular soft voice of a woman trying not to alarm anyone. I was crossing the main road toward the boarding house at the end of the day when Mrs. Patterson appeared on the front step with an expression that stripped 5 years off his blood temperature. She's been down since midday, Mrs. Patterson said. She told me not to bother you. I'm bothering you. He was through the door before the sentence was finished. Dr. Ansel Hayes was the competent doctor. Margaret had identified 3 counties over. He arrived 4 hours after Jonathan's rider went for him fast, by any measure fast enough that the horse was lathered, and Jonathan had spent 4 hours being useful in the most minimal possible sense, which was staying out of the way, and keeping his face composed, and bringing water when asked. Elizabeth was in bed, and not happy about it. That at least was familiar. "It's nothing dramatic," she told him when he came in after the doctor's initial examination. He said, "Rest." He said, "I've been on my feet too much." He said, "Then you'll rest," Jonathan said. She looked at him with the specific expression of a woman who does not appreciate being told what she will do. "The school. I'll manage the school." She stared at him. "You. For a few days, until you're back on your feet." He met her gaze. "I taught Eli the basic principles of property law this morning while he was waiting for you. He had thoughts. He always has thoughts. He wants to know if a 9-year-old can technically own land in Virginia. Can he? I told him we'd look into it." Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment. The resistance in her face did its particular thing, that slow softening. That was not weakness. That was instead the visible process of a strong woman deciding which battles actually mattered. "4 days," she said. "I'll take 4 days. However long it takes." "4 days," she repeated firmly. "All right," he said. He pulled the chair to her bedside. She shifted slightly in the bed, making herself more comfortable. "Jonathan," she said. You're going to be terrible at teaching." "Almost certainly. Eli is going to run the entire operation within 2 days." "He's going to try." Jonathan settled back in the chair. "I'm going to let him think he's succeeding while I quietly maintain authority." Elizabeth looked at him. "That's actually a reasonable teaching strategy. I learned it from watching you." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "When did you start watching?" "Sutter's Creek," he said. "The first day. Through the window before I came in." He paused. "You were reading about the Virginia colony. A child asked why women didn't get to vote, and you said the men hadn't learned yet that they needed women's judgment." She blinked. "You heard that?" "I heard that." He held her gaze. "I also heard what you said after. That some of them eventually learned. The clever ones." A pause. "I'm trying to be a clever one. Late, but trying." She looked at him for a long time. The lamp was low, and her hair was down, and she was tired in a way that was bone deep. The tiredness of a woman who had been holding too many things at once for too long. "Lie down properly," he said. "I'll stay until you're asleep." She opened her mouth. "Not because you need me to," he said before she could. "Because I'd like to, if that's all right." She looked at him. Then she shifted down in the bed and closed her eyes. He sat in the chair. He watched her breathing slow. He watched the precise moment when the tension in her face released the way it always did, when she finally stopped managing things and let herself be unconscious for a while. He stayed for a long time after that. He taught for 3 days. It was, as predicted, a humbling experience. The 6-year-olds had no patience for anything they considered irrelevant, which encompassed most of what he initially attempted. The older children were politely ruthless about gaps in his knowledge. Eli operated as predicted as a de facto co-instructor within the first hour, which Jonathan managed by giving him an official title, Deputy Educator, which Eli wrote on a piece of paper and pinned to his shirt and took entirely seriously. On the second day, a girl named Ruth, who was 7, and had the unnerving directness of someone who had never learned to soften things, sat down across from him at the end of the lesson and said, "You're better than you were yesterday." "Thank you, Ruth." "Still not as good as Mrs. Elizabeth." "Nobody is." Ruth considered this. "Why does she do this? The school. She could live in a big house somewhere." Jonathan looked at her. "Because she loves it. And because some people," he said carefully, "understand that a thing is worth doing, not because it gives them a comfortable life, but because it matters." Ruth squinted at him. "Did she teach you that?" He thought about a ledger with 5 years of careful columns. About medicine for families he had never met. About an old man's granddaughter who was going to teach others someday. Yes, he said. She did. I just wasn't paying attention when she taught it. Ruth seemed to find this an acceptable answer and left. Eli appeared at his elbow. She's testing you, Eli said. Ruth does that. I noticed. You passed. He said it with the authority of a boy who had appointed himself the arbiter of such things. Mrs. Elizabeth will be glad. On the fourth day, Elizabeth came back. She walked in while he was mid-lesson, a reading exercise that had, through a series of developments he could not entirely account for, turned into a debate about whether George Washington should have accepted a third term if one had been offered, and the room lit up in the specific way that rooms lit up when she entered them. Not dramatically, just shifted, like something settling correctly into place. Continue, she said, standing at the back. He looked at her. She was still slightly pale, but her eyes were clear, and her posture was the posture of a woman who had rested against her will and was now alert and present. He continued the debate. She listened without intervening. When the lesson ended and the children dispersed into the afternoon, she came to the front of the room. Washington was right to step down, she said, in case you were going to ask. I wasn't, but I agree. She looked around the room. Everything was in order. He had made sure of that, had spent 30 minutes each evening making sure of that, because he had learned very early in the 3 days that the room's organization was not incidental to how she thought and worked. You moved the geography maps, she said, to the east wall. The morning light was washing them out. She looked at the east wall, then at him. Yes, that's better actually. I noticed you always stood to the right when you referenced them. The angle was working against you. She was quiet for a moment. Eli behaved, she asked. Eli was invaluable. Don't tell him I said that his head is already at structural capacity. The almost smile arrived. Full this time. The whole thing crooked and real and tilting left. Jonathan looked at it and felt something in his chest that he had no interest in being careful about. Elizabeth, he said. She looked at him. I want to ask you something, and I want you to hear it without the weight of everything it implies. Just the question by itself. He held her gaze. Can you do that? She was still for a moment. Ask. Do you want to come home? He said it quietly. Not because of the baby, not because of the county or the estate, or any of the things that are external to this room. I mean, do you want to? He paused. Because I think you could make a life here, Elizabeth. I think you've already made a life here, and it would be a fine one, and I think you know that too. So I'm not asking because I think you need rescuing. I'm asking because I want to know whether you want it, whether the idea of coming back of us trying to build something real this time with what we both know now, whether that's something you want. She looked at him for a long time. I told you I wasn't finished here, she said. I know. The school still needs Eli still. I know. I'm not asking you to leave tomorrow. He held her gaze. I'm asking you to tell me whether you want to come home. Eventually. When you're ready. When we're... He stopped. When it's true. The question sat in the room between them. Outside the settlement was doing its late afternoon things. The sounds of people wrapping up the working day. The smell of supper fires beginning the particular quality of light that came when the sun was thinking about going down. Elizabeth put her hand flat on the desk. Her desk, he had come to think of it. She stood with her hand on it, and her eyes on the geography map he had moved to the east wall, and she was quiet for so long that he had time to understand clearly that whatever she said was going to be the truth and not the comfortable thing. Yes, she said finally. She turned and looked at him. I want to come home. I want what we never actually had. The real version. Her voice was steady, but something moved underneath it. I don't want to go back to what was there before. I want to go forward to something that isn't built yet. That's different. I know it is, he said. And I am not asking you to accept something that isn't built yet as though it's finished. I'm asking you to tell me you want to build it. She held his gaze. I'm telling you. He breathed. He crossed the room and stood in front of her. Close. The closest they had been in months. She looked up at him with those gray-green eyes that he was only now truly learning to read. He reached out and took her hand from the desk. Both hands, one in each of his. Her hands were smaller than he remembered, or he had never paid attention to how small they were. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life paying attention," he said. "I cannot give you the 5 years back. I cannot make it so you didn't have to walk out that door to become who you are now. But I can tell you I am looking at you, Elizabeth. Right now, right here. I see you." His voice dropped. "I should have been saying that from the beginning. I'm saying it now." She looked at him for a long moment. Her hands were warm in his. "That's the thing about now," she said quietly. "It's still something." He raised her hands, both of them, and pressed them briefly to his mouth. An old gesture, formal and simple, and entirely genuine. She did not pull away. "The school," she said after a moment. "I need to find someone to take over. That will take time. I won't leave them without a teacher." "Of course not. And I have conditions for how things are when we go back. Conditions about how the household is managed and how decisions are made, and—" "Write them down," he said. "All of them. I'll read every word." She looked at him with the expression of a woman checking whether she is being humored. Whatever she found in his face apparently satisfied her because the expression settled. "Eli," she said. "I'll talk to Eli. He'll argue. He argues about everything. That's the point." Jonathan looked at her. "He's going to be exceptional, Elizabeth. Whatever he becomes. You did that." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "We should tell him together." "Yes." She looked down at their joined hands. Then she looked up. "Jonathan," she said. "Yes." "The journal." She paused. "The one I made. I have it here." "I know you do. There's a blank page at the back." She held his gaze. "I left it blank because I thought we might fill it together someday, with something that hadn't happened yet." She paused. "I still think that, if you want to." He looked at her, at the gray-green eyes and the crooked smile that was not quite there yet, but was close, very close, and the hands that had managed his entire world for 5 years without being thanked for it. "Yes," he said. "I want to." She nodded once, the decision made. Outside, Eli was doing something that sounded like it involved running and an argument and possibly the deputy educator sign, and the settlement was settling into evening, and the lamp in the schoolhouse caught the last of the day's light and held it. Jonathan Whitaker stood in a small schoolhouse in Sutter's Creek, Virginia, in the late summer of 1818, holding his wife's hands, and understood with the complete and clarifying force of something finally understood properly, that he had nearly lost the most significant thing in his life to his own inattention. That he had been given through no particular merit of his own a second chance. And that what he did with that chance was the only thing left that mattered. Eli did not take the news well. That was expected. What was not expected was the specific form his reaction took. Not the arguing Jonathan had predicted, not the negotiating or the philosophical objection, or the torrent of structured points that characterized everything else the boy did. Eli heard Elizabeth say that she would be leaving Sutter's Creek when a replacement teacher was found, and he went completely silent. For Eli, silence was the loudest possible response. He sat with it for a full 30 seconds, which for a 9-year-old with opinions about judicial elections was an eternity, and then he said very quietly, "You said good teachers stay." Elizabeth looked at him. "I said good teachers stay until their students don't need them anymore. We still need you." "You need a teacher," she said. "That's different, and you'll have one." She leaned forward slightly. "Eli, you taught yourself half of what you know before I ever arrived. You corrected Mr. Crane's mathematics errors when you were 7. You do not need me. You need someone who shows up consistently and gives you room to be who you are. Any good teacher can do that." Eli looked at Jonathan with the expression of a child filing a grievance. "You're taking her away." "She's choosing to go," Jonathan said. "There's a difference. Feels the same from here." Jonathan held the boy's gaze. "I know, and that's fair." He paused. "I'm going to tell you something, Eli. Man to man." He did not add, or man to 9-year-old, because Eli would not have appreciated the clarification. There are people in this world who belong in more than one place. Mrs. Elizabeth belongs here in what she built here, and she belongs somewhere else too. Both things can be true. The mark she made on this school is not going to disappear when she walks out the door. You know that. Eli was quiet for a moment. Then, will she come back? To visit, Elizabeth said. Yes, and you will write to me, detailed letters, about the school and the new teacher and your arguments. She paused. I expect to be kept fully informed about the judicial election situation. It's developing, Eli said with the gravity of a man managing ongoing legislation. I assumed. He looked at her for another long moment. Then, with the decisive movement of a child making a formal gesture, he pulled the deputy educator sign off his shirt and held it out to her. Elizabeth looked at it. That's yours, Eli. Keep it, he said. So you remember we were official about it. She took it from his hand. She looked at it for a moment, the piece of paper with his handwriting on it pressed carefully flat. Then she folded it and put it in her pocket. Thank you, she said. Eli nodded. Then he stood up and walked out of the schoolhouse with his back straight and his chin level, and the careful composure of someone who has decided he is not going to be the kind of person who makes a scene. He made it all the way around the corner of the building before Jonathan heard faintly the sound of a boy sitting down hard on the ground and breathing in the specific pattern of someone working very hard not to cry. He looked at Elizabeth. Go, she said quietly. He went around the corner. Eli was sitting against the building's side wall with his knees pulled up and his forearms resting on them, and his face doing the difficult thing that faces do when someone is 10 seconds away from a feeling they'd rather not have. He looked up when Jonathan appeared and immediately rearranged his expression into something more composed. I'm fine, he said. I know you are. I'm not. I wasn't. Eli. Jonathan sat down on the ground beside him. The ground was dusty, and it was not a dignified position for a man of his age and background, and he did not care in the slightest. You don't have to be fine right now. She's leaving. That's hard. The boy was quiet for a moment. She's the first teacher who ever made me feel like my ideas were... He stopped. Tried again. Like they were real. Like they counted. They are real. They count. Jonathan said it simply. That doesn't change when she leaves. She didn't put that in you, Eli. She saw it. It was already there. Eli turned and looked at him. Is that what happened with you? She saw something in you that was already there. Jonathan thought about that honestly. No, he said. In my case, she saw something that should have been there and wasn't yet. And seeing it, her seeing it, and then me losing her, that's what brought it out. He paused. Sometimes we need loss to understand value. That's a terrible way to learn things, but it's the truest way I know. Eli absorbed this. You're smarter than you seemed that first day, he said. I had a good teacher. The boy almost smiled. She's going to be all right, isn't she? You're going to... He stopped. Chose his words with unusual care. You're going to actually see her, from now on. Yes, Jonathan said, without qualification. I am. Eli nodded. Then he stood up, brushed the dust from his trousers with the efficiency of someone returning to work, and said, The next teacher needs to understand that I have a system for the bookshelf. It's not alphabetical, it's by relevance, which is more sophisticated. I'll make sure they're informed. Good. He walked back around the front of the building. Jonathan sat on the ground for another moment alone and breathed the late summer air. Then he stood up and went back inside. Tanang. The replacement teacher arrived 6 weeks later. Her name was Mrs. Helen Garrow, a widow of 35 from Fredericksburg, with steady eyes and a dry manner, and the specific competence of a woman who had been teaching for 12 years and knew exactly what she was doing. Elizabeth spent 4 days with her before she was satisfied. Jonathan observed part of one of those days from the back of the room and watched Elizabeth transfer 12 weeks of careful work, her systems, her rhythms, her understanding of each child's particular way of learning, with the same precise attention she brought to everything. Mrs. Garrow, to her considerable credit, wrote everything down. On the third day, Eli presented the new teacher with a written summary of his judicial election thesis. Mrs. Garrow read it in its entirety, asked 2 clarifying questions, and said, "You should enter this in the county argumentation competition in the spring." Eli looked at Elizabeth. Elizabeth looked at Jonathan. Jonathan kept his expression neutral. Eli turned back to Mrs. Garrow and said with the contained intensity of someone receiving a new and significant mission, "Tell me about this competition." Elizabeth caught Jonathan's eye across the room. Something passed between them, quick private, the specific wordless communication of 2 people who have been paying attention to the same child and are thinking exactly the same thing. It was the first time in their marriage that had happened naturally, without effort, without either of them reaching for it. They left on a Thursday morning in September. The settlement turned out. Not formally, nobody announced anything, but people found reasons to be on the main road that morning, and Jonathan understood watching it happen that this was Sutter's Creek's version of a send-off. Abel Proctor shook his hand with the grip of a man who had decided in 8 weeks of daily proximity that this particular soft-handed gentleman was worth something after all. "You did decent work," Abel said. From Abel Proctor, Jonathan had come to understand this was approximately equivalent to a declaration of profound respect. "I had a good model," Jonathan said. He glanced at Elizabeth, who was saying goodbye to Mrs. Garrow with the specific seriousness of one professional woman parting from another. Abel followed his gaze and said nothing for a moment. Then, "Treat her right." "I intend to." He paused. "I should have been intending to for years, but now I am." Abel nodded once. The matter was settled in his view. Eli appeared at Elizabeth's elbow with a letter. He held it out with both hands and the formal solemnity of a diplomatic exchange. "For when you get there," he said. "Don't read it until you're home." Elizabeth took it with the same formality. "I'll read it when we arrive." "Good." He looked at Jonathan. "Take care of her." "That's her job," Jonathan said. "Taking care of herself. My job is to make sure she doesn't have to do everything alone." Eli considered this. "That's a better answer than I expected." He stepped back. "Goodbye, Mrs. Whitaker." "Goodbye, Mr. Deputy Educator." The almost smile appeared on his face, real and quick, showing his teeth for just a moment before he contained it and went back to being 9 years old with serious business to attend to. Elizabeth climbed into the carriage. Jonathan followed. Mrs. Patterson waved from her doorstep. The settlement receded. Neither of them looked back for a long time. When Elizabeth finally turned to look through the rear window at Sutter's Creek growing smaller behind them, she did it once and then turned forward again. Her hands were in her lap. The letter from Eli was folded on top of them. "All right?" Jonathan asked. "Yes." She said it the way she said true things, simply without elaboration. "It's mine. That part of my life is mine. Nobody can take what happened there away." "No," he said. "They can't." She looked at him sideways. "You grew something in that mill, you know. It wasn't just me." Abel would dispute that. "Abel cried when we left, Mrs. Proctor told me." Jonathan looked at her. He did not. He absolutely did. She said he pretended it was grain dust. Elizabeth looked out the window. "He's going to miss having someone to be superior to." Jonathan felt the laugh before he could stop it. Real and unguarded, the kind he had not produced in years without performing it first. She turned and looked at him with something warm in her eyes. "There it is," she said. "What? That?" She was still looking at him. "I used to wonder if I'd imagined it. The real version of you. I heard it a few times in the first year, and then it went quiet. I thought I'd imagined it." He held her gaze. "You didn't imagine it." "No," she said. "I didn't." The Whitaker estate looked the same. That was the first thing Jonathan thought pulling up the drive, that the place had continued being itself, while everything else had changed with the particular indifference of land and buildings to human upheaval. The oak trees were still in the front drive. The wide wraparound porch was still there. The 3 stories of Virginia timber looked as they always had in September light. Elizabeth looked in the house for a long moment through the carriage window. "It's the same," she said. "Yes." It'll feel different. I think so. He looked at it too. I've been thinking about what you said, your conditions, about how the household is managed and how decisions are made. I wrote them down, she said. The way you asked. I read them. He turned to look at her. All 3 pages. She looked at him. That took me 4 attempts to write without it sounding like a woman who'd spent 5 years knowing exactly what was wrong and finally had permission to say it. He held her gaze. Every single thing on those 3 pages was reasonable. More than reasonable. He paused. I want to add one. She raised an eyebrow. The household accounts stay with you, he said. Not as a managed task, as your domain, your decisions. I want a standing meeting every week, whatever day you choose, where you tell me what you're managing, and I listen and offer input only when you ask for it. He met her eyes. I want to know what you're doing, not to oversee it, to understand it. Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment. You read them carefully. 3 pages, front and back on the second. He paused. The 3rd page had a footnote. The footnote was about the kitchen garden. I know. I agree about the kitchen garden. The carriage stopped. The door opened. Jonathan stepped down and held out his hand. Elizabeth looked at his hand. She took it. They walked into the house together. The county came calling within the week. That was inevitable. Jonathan had expected it and prepared for it the way he prepared for things now, by talking to Elizabeth about it first, asking what she wanted and following her lead. What she wanted, it turned out, was simple and direct. She hosted a small dinner. 8 couples from the county's primary families, the ones who had been doing the most talking by Thomas Hargrove's account, and whose silence would carry the most weight. She organized it herself. She cooked 3 of the dishes herself, which surprised the kitchen staff and would have surprised the guests if they'd known. She sat at the head of her own table and conducted the conversation with the ease of a woman who had spent 12 weeks running a one-room school for 14 children with widely varying abilities and levels of cooperation, and found a room full of adult Virginians considerably more manageable. Jonathan watched her do it. He watched her field the careful questions about her absence. She called it a summer away, which was accurate and sufficient, and the less careful questions about her health, about the coming child, about the estate, about whether things were as they should be. She answered each one with the specific precision of a woman who had thought very carefully about what she was and was not willing to give away. And Jonathan, for the first time in 5 years, spoke about his wife in a room full of people the way a man should speak about someone he loves. It happened naturally. He did not announce it. He did not make a speech or draw attention to it. But when Harrison Alcott Preston's older brother, a quieter man with his brother's social ambitions, but more tact, made a comment across the table about Elizabeth's decision to teach, framing it in the slightly condescending way of a man who found the choice eccentric, Jonathan said without heat. My wife identified an educational need in a settlement of 40 families and built a functioning school from nothing in 3 weeks. She selected and trained her own replacement before she left. She is, he said, looking at Elizabeth directly, the most capable person in this room. The table went quiet. Elizabeth held his gaze. Something moved across her face. Not surprise exactly, but something that recognized what had just happened and what it meant. Harrison Alcott cleared his throat and said something complimentary and redirected the conversation, and the dinner moved on. But the thing had been said in public in front of the people who would carry it forward, and Elizabeth had heard it, and that was the point. After the guests were gone and the house was quiet, she found him in the study. She stood in the doorway. Harrison Alcott is going to be talking about that for a month, she said. Good. She leaned against the doorframe. You didn't have to do that publicly. I know. He looked at her. I wanted to. There's a difference. He paused. I spent 5 years not saying true things in rooms full of people. I'm done with that. She was quiet for a moment. The pound cake Margaret sent arrived, she said. It's in the kitchen. Is it better than the one in Sutter's Creek? It's exactly the same. She uses the same recipe regardless of circumstance. Elizabeth looked at him. She sent a letter with it. She said. Elizabeth stopped, looked at her hands briefly. She said she hopes we get it right this time. She said some marriages are worth 2 tries. Jonathan stood up from the desk. He crossed the room to the doorway where she was standing. He stopped close enough that she would have to choose to step back. She did not step back. "I want to show you something," he said. I went to the desk and opened the bottom drawer, the one he had been saving for this moment, which he had thought about during the last 3 weeks in Sutter's Creek, and prepared carefully. He took out a journal. New. Good leather. Blank. He held it out to her. She looked at it, then at him. "It's not the same as yours," he said. "I know that. What you made the history you kept, that's yours. I'm not trying to replace it." He paused. "This is for what comes next, if you want it." She took it from his hands. She ran her thumb across the cover, the habit of a reader, the automatic assessment of a book. "I don't know how it ends," she said. "About the journal, about all of it. Neither do I." He held her gaze. "I know how I want it to go. I know what I'm going to do differently. But I don't know how it ends, and I think that's right. I think it should be." He searched for the word. "Earned. Day by day." She looked at the journal in her hands. "The baby is going to come in February," she said. Dr. Hayes was specific. "I know. That's 4 months. I know. A great deal can change in 4 months. A great deal has changed in 4 months," he said. "Already. More than I changed in the 5 years before that." She looked up at him. "Don't make me a promise you don't know you can keep." "I am not making you a promise about who I will be," he said. "I am making you a promise about what I will do. Every day. I will look at you. I will listen when you speak. I will ask what you need and mean the question. I will say, in whatever room I'm standing in, that you are remarkable." He did not look away from her. "That is not a promise about feeling. It's a promise about action. Action I can control." He paused. "That's the promise I'm making." She held his gaze for a long time. Then she opened the journal to the first page. She held out her hand for the pen on his desk. He gave it to her. She wrote something on the first page, quick, decided, without hesitation. She closed the journal and handed it back to him. He looked at what she had written. September 1818. We begin again. This time both of us. He stood with the journal in his hands and felt the full weight of those 12 words settle into him, what they meant, what they cost her to write, what they required of him going forward. Not a resolution, not a restoration, a beginning, a real one. The kind built on what was true and what was known and what had been learned at considerable price by 2 people who had both in different ways been failing to be honest. "There's one more thing," Elizabeth said. He looked up. She had moved to the small writing desk against the wall, the one in the corner, the one he now knew was where she did her best thinking. She opened the top drawer and took out the original journal, the one she had made, the one with 3 months of memories and 1 3-sentence letter and a blank page at the back. She brought it to him. She opened it to the last page, the blank one. "You said you wanted to fill it together," she said. "I meant that. I still mean it." She held his gaze. "But I want you to write the first word. Not me. You." He looked at the blank page. He looked at her. He took the pen. He wrote 1 word at the top of the blank page, and then he handed the journal back to her, and she read it, and something crossed her face that was not the almost smile, that was not the careful restraint she had worn for so long. It was the full thing, unguarded and real and completely her. The word he had written was seen. The baby came in February, as Dr. Hayes had predicted, on a morning when the Virginia frost was still on the ground and the house was warm from fires in every room. Jonathan did not leave the house. He had told the steward 2 weeks prior that whatever happened in February, he was to be found immediately, and he was not to be redirected for any reason, including estate business, weather, or the arrival of Thomas Hargrove. He was there the entire time. Elizabeth did not ask him to be. He simply was. When it was over, when the doctor stepped back and the room settled into the particular quiet of something new and enormous. Having arrived, Jonathan sat on the edge of the bed beside his wife with a daughter in his arms, small and red-faced and entirely certain of her own importance already, and he looked at Elizabeth. She was exhausted in a way he had never seen before. The full weight of it on her face, and beneath the weight, something else. Something that recognized that she had just done a very large thing, and that large things were within her capacity. He had known that for months now. He saw it confirmed again in the steadiness of her eyes, in the way she reached out for the child with the specific sureness of a woman who was not afraid. "She's perfect," Elizabeth said. "Yes. She has your jaw. She has your eyes. Lord help her." Jonathan laughed, the real version, the unperformed one, the one Elizabeth had said she'd heard only a few times in the first year of their marriage, and then missed. He saw her register it, saw the satisfaction of it move across her face. "What do we name her?" he said. Elizabeth looked at the baby for a moment. "Clara," she said. "After Mrs. Bowen in Millhaven, who didn't have to be kind to a woman traveling alone, and was anyway." "Clara," Jonathan said. "Clara Margaret," Elizabeth added. "Because Margaret will be insufferable if she isn't included, and she did actually come all that way." "Clara Margaret Whitaker," Jonathan said. The baby made a sound of vigorous opinion. They both looked at her. "She's already arguing," Jonathan said. "Of course she is. She's ours." Elizabeth looked at him. The word ours sat between them, plain and enormous, and entirely right. "Give her to me." He transferred the baby with the careful deliberateness of a man who is aware he is holding something that matters more than any ledger or any acreage or any name in any county. Elizabeth took her daughter and looked at her with the expression of a woman who has just met someone she already knows completely. Jonathan sat beside them. "I thought about a parlor in July and 3 sentences on a dressing table, and a woman walking out a side gate in the dark with an old travel bag and her mother's hairbrush." He thought about a boy named Eli and a one-room school and the specific dignity of a man learning to be useful at a mill in a settlement that didn't know his name. He thought about a blank page and a new journal and one word written at the top in his own handwriting. I thought about what it cost to see someone, really see them. How it required the deliberate setting aside of everything that made a person comfortable. The assumptions, the convenience, the habit of taking what functioned correctly for granted. How it was not a feeling but a choice made daily, and how he had failed to make it for years, and how the cost of that failure had nearly been everything. He thought about what everything had nearly been. "Jonathan," Elizabeth said. "Yes." She was still looking at Clara. "I'm glad you came after me." He was quiet for a moment. I'm glad you didn't make it easy." She turned and looked at him. The real smile, full crooked, tilting left. "I wasn't going to." "I know," he said. "That's what I mean." She turned back to their daughter. He stayed where he was. Outside Virginia was cold and bright and honest, in the way that February was honest without the softness of spring or the haze of summer, just clear and direct and exactly itself. Inside the fire was warm and the room was quiet, and Clara Margaret Whitaker was making her opinion of the world known in the thorough and unapologetic way that she would continue to make her opinions known for the rest of her life. Because she was, after all, Elizabeth Monroe Whitaker's daughter. And Elizabeth Monroe Whitaker had spent long enough in rooms where her voice went unheard. Her daughter would not have that problem. Jonathan Whitaker looked at his wife and his child, and the morning light coming through the window, and made the choice, the daily choice. The only one that mattered, to see everything in front of him clearly and to never, as long as he lived, mistake what was irreplaceable for what was simply familiar. Some people spend a lifetime waiting to be seen. Elizabeth Monroe Whitaker had done her waiting. She would not wait again because the man beside her had finally learned at considerable cost and not a moment before. It was almost too late that the greatest thing a person can offer. Another is not a name, not a house, not a place in society, but the simple and revolutionary act of looking at them, truly, looking and saying without hesitation, without condition, without the need for an audience, "I see you. I have always seen you, and I am not looking away."